to all of you here and online. I welcome your checking out this revolutionary possibility for advancing human rights. Now, this is my first day back here since I was a senior in college taking a public health class. And it feels like not that long ago, but a little arithmetic tells me it's been 2% of the time since the era of Hippocrates in ancient Greece. So to me, it seems like time has been fleeting, except if I look at the rate of progress in human rights, I would describe that as glacial. Now, one effort to amp that up has been a series of presentations on the International Food Security Treaty. One of the first ones was at Harvard Law School. There have been many others, including the law schools of Yale and UCLA, the medical center at University of California, San Francisco. We've had a couple there, public health programs at NYU and Johns Hopkins, a major UN food conference in Rome, 5 times on Capitol Hill, but this is the first time that one has been co-sponsored by universities, centers for law and public health. This is where a conversation about hunger eradication needs to be. Now, this is, by this I'm referring to ending hunger, a kind of a moonshot. When America accomplished its astronomical moonshot more than 50 years ago, people were thrilled, understandably. What's interesting, though, is a lot of people back then said, if we can put a man on the moon, I should hope we're able to end hunger on Earth. And there's good reasoning in that. Barack Obama, when he was running for president, said, hope is not blind optimism. It is imagining and then fighting and struggling for something that didn't seem possible before. To hope, to thrive, hope has to be backed up by action. Otherwise, a kind of mental paralysis sets in. That's where we allow our vision of the future to be clouded by memories of past limitations and failures. Now, it's a good thing babies don't think like that. When we're babies, at a certain point, we've never walked a single step in our lives, but we envision what we want to do, we struggle, we stand up, we get on with it and go for a walk. Regrettably, some 13 to 17 years after babyhood, most of us have got that mental paralysis bug. I'm sure I did, because we grow up steeped in the paradigm that hunger's just got to be part of life here because that's the human condition. Now, governments like that construct, whether they're conscious of it or not, as evidenced by their behavior. It lets them off the hook. So, I mean, what can you do about the human condition, right? Except they did find a way to act against terrorism after 9/11. And there was only one of those. Imagine the upheaval and overdrive they'd be in now if there is another 9/11 on 9/12. And another every 3.5 hours, day and night ever since then, plus hundreds of thousands of more of 9/11 scale attacks, each with 3,000 victims instead of being killed, are crippled by illness. But those are the proportions of the real world nightmare of malnutrition that destroys families like this by the millions. Casualties far exceed those wrought by the Nazis in World War II. There are more deaths and disabilities each year from malnutrition than from all the world's crimes and wars put together by far. The well-fed are suffering as well because the high death rates lead to high birth rates, which lead to overpopulation, which has some dire spin-offs, including environmental damage and environmental and political instability. And imagine the kind of stability we're going to be enjoying. This continues with the deadly combo of global heating and hunger-fueled overpopulation make food and fresh water seem as valuable as gold. And all the while, hunger is gnawing at the minds of almost everybody. It spawns troubling doubts as we try to reassure ourselves, well, I mean, it is just the way it is. What can we do about it? Now, this was the mindset of a George Packer essay in the New York Times. He said, "You've done nothing about hunger, nor will you. You feel a sense of impotent guilt, the mental residue of millions of suffering human beings for whom we've done nothing." That phrase, "nor will you," that is poisonous baloney. It is psychologically debilitating. It chooses failure. It mires humanitarian impulses in a guilt-ridden slew of too little, too late fractional measures that leave 750 million people desperately hungry. And it also sickens the minds of whole nations with a split personality syndrome. America, most of all, we got one personality that boasts America is the greatest and most powerful nation in the history of the world when it comes to world hunger. Well, the other personality comes to the fore, slinks into the background, joins the general whimpering. "Oh, that sweet little girl, Ma, she seems so nice, but bleep happens and we can't help it if she went weeks without eating. That's the human condition." The only condition we're enfeebled by is the one the teenagers in the novel Upsurge call ads, the acceptance of avoidable death and suffering, the disease that cripples the spirit of who's got it and the body of somebody else. Due to malnutrition, ads kills at 12 times the rate of AIDS. It afflicts 19 times as many people who have HIV. But due to malnutrition, this plague keeps going on. The sad truth is that there's no death more avoidable than death from hunger. Hunger is not lung cancer. It's less daunting than the common cold because there is a preventive and curative measure for it called food. Experts have long agreed that there's enough of that to go around and that governments could long ago have abolished hunger if they wanted to. But the best they've come up with so far are some underfunded food development and aid programs and some flowery declarations. The grandpappy of those was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which at least stated that access to adequate food is a human right. Now, the good news is that ads can be cured. We'll call in a consulting doctor, Harvard Nobel laureate, economist, Amartya Sen, regarded as the world's leading expert on the economics of poverty. And he has said for a long time, in the modern era, nobody starves unless someone else wants them to. Starvation is a hellacious weapon. It was the weapon of choice for Stalin, massacring hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians in the 1930s. Similar tactics and results haunt the records of the British and Nigerians in Biafra in the 60s, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 70s, the insurgents and counterinsurgents in Ethiopia in the 80s, Janjaweed livestock looters in Darfur in the 90s, the Soviet-led blockade of Yemen in the 2010s. And if you want, we can discuss during Q&A current situations involving the Mideast and Ukraine and so forth. But this is a nasty business, and it can backfire. Winston Churchill found that out the hard way at the end of the armistice. At the end of World War I, he thought it'd be a Jim Dandy idea for the Allies to keep up the blockade against Germany to force concessions at the peace table. He said, starvation is a powerful lever for negotiation. Well, there was some truth in that. The Allies pressed hard on that lever for 7 months after the armistice until the collapse of Germany at Versailles. So great, the hunger weapon worked. Forgot about it. Except one German politician didn't forget about it. He used the memory of the hunger weapon as a weapon itself against the Allies and democracy. His name was Adolf Hitler. The German government warned years before he came to power that this was going to be a major problem. They said hunger is an important factor in the entire Hitler movement. Of course, later he deployed that same weapon himself against the Russians, leading the besieged citizens of Leningrad to cannibalism, murder for ration cards. Now, any population victimized by the hunger weapon is suffering a major public health disorder. Epidemiologist Jeffrey Rose observed wisely that the primary determinants of disease are economic and social. Treating the famine disease calls for the social medicine of human rights law. And that means hard law, not the high-minded but toothless proposals that poses laws but are never enforced. Of course, they're not enforced because nobody ever bothered to provide for enforcement in the first place. When it comes to human rights, enforceable laws dare not speak its name. As a result, the UN laws protecting the right to food supposedly have loopholes big enough to bulldoze 20,000 emaciated corpses through every day. Now, the UN Security Council did undertake a condemnation of the use of hunger as a weapon a few years ago. 2,000 words, including the words stresses, urges, calls on strongly, requests, and further requests, but not once the verb enforce. Now, sure, enforcement-free law is a nice low upfront cost. No reason to spend a dime on courts or prisons or police. So who's up for abolishing enforcement of the laws against armed robbery, kidnapping, rape, and murder? Hands? Oh, no one. Well, maybe that's because, as a Justice Duke Ellington might have opined, if it ain't got that legal axe swing, it don't mean a thing. Nonetheless, axe-phobic governments, the 1996 World Food Summit in Rome, they refused, especially the US, they refused to strengthen the right to food in law, which we were calling for. They opted instead for yet another aspirational declaration and a plan of action that called for cutting the number of hungry, then 1 billion people, in half over the following 19 years. That was a pretty faint call to arms. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that such timid goal setters failed to meet that target by 300 million hungry people. And that's a target which, even if it had been met, would have left 500 million other people hungry. This is not to say that declarations should be necessarily filed in the dumpster. Look at that Declaration of Independence we have. It does have a bit in it about all men are endowed with an inalienable right of liberty. Was that a hypocritical crock from a bunch of people that included some slave owners? Let's not get too trigger happy, because as President Lincoln said, granted 90 years later, but you can argue well to what extent he was correct in it, but what he maintained was, quote, the drafters did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then enjoying equality. They meant to declare the right so that enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. Well, folks, we check the horizon. The second quarter of the 21st century is glimmering there, and it is prime time for a paradigm shift. Circumstances are evolving to a point where we can look to the human right of freedom from hunger being protected by enforceable law. And they brought us together this evening to get a look at the solution to the world's single most deadly problem. The International Food Security Treaty aims to catalyze a global commitment to fulfill the human right of freedom from hunger and to protect it with enforceable law. The whole treaty in draft form, 700 words. You can find it at the treaty's website. It just boils down to 4 principles. Each signatory nation is obliged to guarantee access to minimal nutrition to everybody within their borders who can't get it on their own, to contribute to the World Food Reserve and Resource Center to assist any nation needing emergency help to meet that guarantee, to establish and enforce law criminalizing the use of hunger as a weapon, and to support UN food security enforcement actions if any nation is proven unwilling or unable to enforce the law on its own. At that website, you'll find articles on the treaty in journals of international affairs, including one that shows this, it illustrates this path of how we get from here to there. The treaty's first phase was about gathering support for it from political and religious leaders, experts in international law, human rights, and hunger. And these included Amartya Sen and the UN official who was in charge of the global response to the famine in Sudan in the 1980s. He said, this is potentially the centerpiece of a whole system by which the capacity to feed its people is translated into a real commitment to do something, because there's no fundamental need for hunger now. Also, the statement from the very first person in Washington to see the treaty, a seasoned realist, had been White House counsel, the chief judge of the Federal Appeals Court in Washington, a Congressman, Abner Mikva. He wrote back immediately, this makes the utmost sense. Another pious platitude and favored reading will not accomplish the task. And then, not long after that, the first senator to see the treaty was the late Dianne Feinstein. She said this could not only eradicate starvation, but strengthen the international justice system. So now the treaty's in its second phase. We have to get it sponsored by governments before the United Nations. Later phases will focus on expanding ratifications, establishing the treaty infrastructure, and pushing for universality. And all along the way, we can see hunger would likely begin to diminish, which would boost the treaty's momentum. Now, you have a neighboring congressman here who is co-chair of the House Hunger Caucus, Jim McGovern. One of these Washington briefings, he said, this treaty is doable. And why not? It doesn't mess with any country's borders, trade, agriculture, commerce, military preparedness. It will alleviate population, because as high death rates decline, high birth rates will decline. It will improve international stability. President Eisenhower told the Republican National Convention once, it is madness to suppose that there could be an island of tranquility and prosperity in a sea of wretchedness and frustration. That was prescient. Europeans can attest to that. Recent years, hundreds of thousands of wretched and frustrated refugees have washed up on their shores, either dead already or praying for relief from hunger and the sieges of oppression. And we have reflections of that on our own southern border every day. Now, if America backs this treaty, that would boost U.S. national security. And Congressman McGovern said this too. We could use an antidote to the poison spewed by terrorists trying to depict us as busting our buttons and self-satisfaction. Galvanizing a coalition willing to end hunger would burnish our national image to a real shine. Back in 2004, the U.S. military sent planes, helicopters, 13,000 personnel to the region to assist in rescue missions, looking for victims, delivering food aid. And a year later, polling in the region found that favorability ratings for the U.S. had quadrupled, while support for Osama bin Laden crumpled. The IFST is doable also because it avoids entanglement in more controversial issues. Now, this treaty has just one goal: eliminate malnutrition. That kind of focus is needed to get governments over their fears of binding international agreements. It's what resonates with the gut-wrenching sympathy that people have always felt for the starving. Fine points of trade deals, sustainable development plans, small farmer support, restrictions on GMOs, these and many other issues which have a great deal of importance are not included in the treaty. They are not found in the Bible or the Quran or any other sacred text, but alleviating the agony of the hungry is found in virtually all of them. So all that's needed to get this doable deed done is for enough people to follow the time-honored 8-word game plan for social justice. Pressure governments and get others to do likewise. Now, that means calling your lawmakers and telling them, I expect you to do everything in your power to advance the International Food Security Treaty. If they're already on record supporting the treaty, call them anyway. Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici told the audience at one IFST presentation how important it is to let the lawmakers do the right thing, know that you are grateful and you're backing them, and encourage them to do more. People, especially those in public health and law, have got to strip the blinders off lawmakers whose idea of responding to hunger is to sign off on the latest weak palliative to come crawling down the road. Their tunnel vision for these little bonsai trees of charity blinds them to the ferocious forest of lawlessness and squandered opportunity. Potential action doesn't have to take a lot of time. 4 calls, 4 minutes. Anybody not in a coma can find 4 minutes somewhere along the line to end world hunger. Now, there are going to be people who say, and people at Harvard and elsewhere, okay, I'm busy. I've got projects. Well, people have always had projects, places like Harvard back in the 19th century. 1/5 of the people in the Boston Vigilance Committee that backed the Underground Railroad, and about half of the founders of the Anti-Slavery Society were people from Harvard with Harvard affiliations. They found their 4 minutes and then some. 4 minutes isn't much, but it sure beats silence. Silence is what allows government officials to bask in the warm bath of the status quo. But that's why they need citizens to push them and to encourage them to do the right thing. They have to get over their fears of catching flack from extremes. Maybe they're worried about hammer-headed leftists haunted by nightmares of American imperialism in the shadows, or right-wingers braying that hunger eradication is bound to cost too much or reward the lazy. Without your guidance, too many are going to resort to pseudo-pragmatic, laissez-faire economics that basically functions as an excuse for involuntary mass manslaughter. One congressional staffer told me he doubted his boss would support the treaty's broad principles. He said, well, the devil can be in the details. Yes, sometimes the devil is in the details, and sometimes it's in the use of that saying as an excuse for the perverse comfort of pessimism and ducking out. There are always going to be objections when social justice gets rolling. But I hope all of you here and online will make the case anyway, because eventually you're planting seeds that might flower some later day. And if you keep at it, you will find new allies who say, yeah, we got to get this done. When UN Undersecretary General Strong was asked, is the time for the treaty right? He said, no, and it won't get right unless people like you campaign for it. He said, initiatives like this need to be backed by small groups of people with strong convictions who are prepared to prevail against a general mood of apathy. Now, if enough of us inspire others to help the treaty, talk of it's going to move on to other campuses, congregations, communities, water coolers, social networks, and so on, news media, all over the world. But if Harvard and Boston are seen as not getting behind it, some people are going to say, well, maybe there's something screwy about this idea of ending hunger. That will hurt the treaty. And whatever hurts the treaty will prolong the era of mass hunger. The ancient sage Hillel used to ask, if not now, when? And we in Boston ought to ask, if not here, where? Great mass movements don't start with great masses. Like snowballs, they accumulate mass and momentum as they get rolling. In the mid-19th century, the Seneca Falls Convention that prepared the first formal demand for the right of all American women to vote was signed by just 100 people in the United States. In 1831, the anti-slavery magazine, The Liberator, began publication 4 miles from this room. It had a staff of just 2. Now, those folks didn't have any universal declaration of rights, human rights, or scripture to stand on. Millions thought banning women from the polls and slavery were just fine. But they kept at it, and they eventually secured the human rights of female enfranchisement and liberation from slavery into hard law. And they did it without cell phones, the internet, broadcasting. The IFST has all those tools and more to obliterate a horror no sane person wants to continue. The hunger holocaust has no Axis armies requiring the sacrifice of tens of millions of soldiers to defeat it. There's no religion promoting malnutrition. Hunger really ain't got nothing but inertia and this morbid Cassandras intoning that toxic cliche about the hunger plague is always going to be with us because it's the human condition. Anyone who doubts that hunger could be rolled a decade or two ought to consider that in 1988, the Soviet Union and apartheid seemed as immutable as the Rock of Gibraltar. And polio was attacking 1,000 more children every day. That year, anti-polio campaigners reshaped the mindset at the World Health Assembly. They got them to act on the global polio eradication initiative, and within 15 years, new cases of polio had plummeted 99.8%. And by then, the Soviet Union and apartheid had long been brushed into history's famous garbage heap. Ending world hunger is an achievable moonshot. It's monumental, as was the NASA moonshot, but it required 400,000 workers to do the Apollo project and a decade of brilliant technological innovation. Hunger eradication doesn't require a day of technological innovation. What it requires is kind of law-changing shockwave that has always propelled social justice. Now, this is what a shockwave looks like in the physical realm. This is a star nursery in the Triangulum Galaxy. And stars there are getting energized enough to trigger shock waves that compress nearby gas to ignite new stars. So it goes in the social physics of paradigm shifts. Small number of energy sources can be any of us, can trigger in others the thunderstriking realization that what had seemed impossible is possible. That's what the treaty's first phase was about. So how are we going to get it to this next level or through this second phase? Well, Abraham Lincoln had a good answer to that. Talking about abolition, he said, what we do will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. Even we here hold the power and bear the responsibility. Well, even we here, and comes to hunger, hold the power and bear the responsibility of getting this treaty before the UN. Now, we could take a pass. That's what Senator Schumer said a few weeks ago. Most senators prefer to do. Something new comes along, somebody else will take care of it, or if not, whatever. But to paraphrase Buckminster Fuller, if we do manage to wrestle hunger to the ground over the next 15 years, either we'll be the only intelligent species between here and there to have pulled it off, or we'll join others that have already done so. But in either case, the thought is staggering. Now imagine a child of yours or a grandchild at that time. Kid's looking at the History Channel, sees appalling images of the world's last terrible starvation from long before, the way we look at pictures of slave markets. The kid asks you to explain, how could the world have let that happen? Well, we would be the first generation ever able to say that's just the way it was with hunger for a long time, but a bunch of us helped put a stop to it. Imagine being a kid raised by people who can say that, knowing that their elders had taken command of a millennia's old scourge and whacked it. And finally, we're going to check out the imaginings of dozens of artists from the US and abroad and see how they've depicted the treaty's epic journey in its own animated short film, Thunderhead Clearing. I thank you all for listening. I thank you in advance for the success of the Food Security Treaty, which I believe will someday be traceable back in part to actions taken by people in this room and listening online. You've heard my take on the International Food Security Treaty, and I look forward to hearing yours. Thanks a lot.